Qays and Yaman refers to the factional rivalry and conflict that first emerged among the Arab tribes that constituted the Umayyad army and administration in the 7th and 8th centuries. Affiliation with either faction was rooted in the genealogical origins, really perceived, of the Arab tribes, which divided them into South Arabian descendants of Qahtan and North Arabian descendants of Adnan Yamani tribes, including the Kalb, Ghassan, Tanukh, Judham and Lakhm, were well established in central and southern Syria in pre-Islamic times, while Qaysi tribes, such as the Sulaym, Kilab and Uqayl, largely migrated to northern Syria and Upper Mesopotamia with the Muslim armies in the mid-7th century. The Qays-Yaman feud did not effectively take shape until after the reign of Caliph Mu'awiyah I, who, along with his Sufyanid descendants, were tied to the Kalb, the leading tribe of Yaman, through marriage and military dependence. When the last Sufyanid caliph died in 684, the Yaman resolved to ensure continued Umayyad rule so as to maintain the stately privileges, while the Qays backed Abdullah ibn Zubayr's bid for the caliphate. That year, the Yaman routed the Qays at the Battle of Majrahit, leading to years of revenge-driven, tit-for-tat raids known as Ayyam because the battles were typically day-long affairs. By 693, the Ayyam largely subsided as the Qays reconciled with the Umayyads and were incorporated into the state. Umayyad caliphs attempted to balance the powers and privileges of both factions, but the rivalry smoldered until the Third Muslim Civil War, in which the Yaman killed Caliph Walid II for his dependence on the Qays. Yamani opposition continued under Caliph Mu'awiyah II, and the Yaman ultimately defected to the Abbasids as the latter conquered the Umayyad realm in 750. The Yaman and Qays briefly joined forces against the Abbasids later that year, but were defeated. Qays-Yaman rivalry diminished significantly under the Abbasids, who did not derive the bulk of their military support from either faction. Nonetheless, the feud persisted at the local level to varying degrees in the following centuries, which saw occasional outbreaks of Qays-Yaman violence. During the Ottoman era, between the 16th and mid-19th centuries, the rivalry saw a resurgence in Mount Lebanon and Palestine, and affiliation with either faction transcended ethnicity and religion and was made by families with little consideration to genuine tribal lineage. In Mount Lebanon, the feud was mostly fought out between different Druze clans until the Battle of Ain Dara in 1711 led to the near-complete exodus of Yamani Druze. Across Palestine, the rivalry encompassed Bedouin tribesmen, peasant clans and townsfolk. Most actual fighting took place in Nablus and its hinterland and the area around Jerusalem. The feud gradually dissipated with the growth of Ottoman centralization in the mid-19th century. Origins. Genealogical differences. The ancient origins of the Qays-Yaman division are traditionally based on an Arab tribe's northern or southern Arabian roots. Really perceived, the Qays were from northern Arabia, while the Yaman were from southern Arabia. Genealogically, the northern tribes were traditionally said to descend from Ishmael, while the southern tribes were said to descend from Qahtan. Historical Arab sources sometimes referred to the southern Arabs as Qahtaniya, but more often called them al-Yaman or al-Yamaniya. By contrast, northern Arabs were seldom referred to as Ishmaelites, possibly because that term came to refer to Arabs in general. Rather, the northerners were described as Adnanites after Adnan, a distant descendant of Ishmael, or called after one of the descendants of Adnan, namely his son Nazar, the latter's son Muda, or one of Mud'ah's descendants. descendants Qays. Moreover, not all of the northern Arabs came under the labels Muda or Qays. The Rabra, whose traditional homeland was eastern Arabia, also traced the descent to Nizar. Regardless of the northern ancestry, the Rabra's allegiance vacillated between Qays, Muda and Yaman, and historical Arab sources often referred to them as a third party to the Qays-Yaman feud. This north-south distinction existed among the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula since pre-Islamic times. However, there is no mention of hostility between the two groupings in pre-Islamic Arab tradition. The Qays did not function as a tribal confederation before the advent of Islam, and in ancient Arab histories, the tribes that would form the confederation were mentioned individually rather than as a collective. According to historian W. Montgomery Watt, it was during the Umayyad era that the Arab tribes began organizing themselves along northern and southern lines so as to constitute something like a political party. The rivalry between Yaman and Qays may have stemmed from competition over grazing rights in Syria following the conquest. However, open conflict between them occurred only during the Second Muslim Civil War. Geographical distribution during the Umayyad and Abbasid eras. One of the bases of the Qays-Yaman division was geographical. Syria was divided into 5 military administrative districts. Philastin centered around Ramla, Al-Urdun centered around Tiberias, Damascus centered around Damascus, Him centered around Hims, and Qanasrin centered around Qalb. Traditionally, it is held that the Yamani tribes inhabited the southern Ajnad of Syria, namely Philastin and Al-Urdun, but the reality was more complex. According to historian Paul M. Kopp, Al-Urdun was clearly dominated by the Yamin, particularly the Ashur tribe, but Philastin was an abode for Yamani and Qaysi tribes, who viewed the district as particularly profitable. By the end of the Umayyad era, however, Yamin apparently was the predominant faction in Philastin. The tribes of Damascus, which included the regions of Ghouta, Hauran and Transjordan and was even more profitable than Philastin, were predominantly Yamani, though a significant Qaysi minority existed. The Yaman also dominated Hims, including the Palmyrene steppe, while the Qays dominated Qanasrin, along with Upper Mesopotamia and the Byzantine frontier as far as Armenia. Some of the Yamani tribes, including the Kalb, Tanukh, and Judham, had settled in Syria prior to the 7th century Muslim conquest. Well established in the regions, many of the Yamani tribes formed alliances with the Byzantine Empire, which controlled the region prior to the Muslim conquest, and embraced Christianity. Some sections of certain Yamani tribes remained Christian following the Muslim conquest. Many of the Qays tribes, particularly the Kilab, Sulaym and Uqayl, were moved to Upper Mesopotamia from Arabia by the Umayyad Caliph Mu'awiyah. At the same time, a number of Yamani tribes in Mu'awiyah's army, such as the Kinda and the Hadrami, joined other established Yamani tribes around Homs. Meanwhile, the Qays-Muda-Yaman conflict in Iraq, specifically Basra, was rooted in the mass migration of southern Azd tribesmen from Oman to Basra just prior to the Second Muslim Civil War. Before then, Basra was dominated by northern tribesmen from the Muda faction, led by the Taman tribe, and the Rabra faction. The Azd became allies with Rabra, despite the latter's northern roots. With this, the parties had been formed for future conflict, according to historian G.R. Horting. Moreover, because the Arab troops of Ghassan came from the Basra garrison, the Qays-Muda-Yaman conflict carried over into that vast eastern province of the Caliphate. The migration of Qaysi tribes to northern Syria and Upper Mesopotamia and of the Yamani Azd to Basra upset the tribal balance of power in these regions, which significantly influenced the Qays-Muda-Yaman feud. Umayyad era, Battle of Majrahit. It is likely the Qays and Yaman factions firmly took shape after Mu'awiyah I's reign. Previously, differences between Qaysi and Yamani tribes were fairly harmless, according to historian UN Kennedy. Mu'awiyah's reliance on Kalb troops and his son Yazid's mother being Kalbi caused unease among Qays chieftains. Meanwhile, political disarray spread throughout the caliphate in the wake of Caliph Yazid's death in 683 and his successor Mu'awiyah II several weeks later. There were no obvious successes among the ruling Sulaym branch of the Umayyad dynasty, which the Kalb were determined to preserve so as to maintain the administrative and military privileges they acquired under them. Thus, the Kalb's chieftain, Ghassan ibn Malik ibn Badal, assembled the representatives of the Yamani tribes of Syria for a shura in Jabayah, wherein they chose an Umayyad outsider, Marwan, to be the next caliph. Marwan made significant political concessions to the Kalb, which drove the Qays, led by the governor of Damascus, al-Darak ibn Qays al-Fihri, to back Abdullah ibn Zubair's claim to the caliphate. Marwan and the Kalb set up camp at Majrahit overlooking al-Darak's Damascus headquarters, and were soon joined by the Yamani Ghassanids and Kinda. Other Yamani tribes that joined Marwan were the Tayy, al-Qayn and Tanukh. As the Qays under al-Darak marched toward Marwan's camp, a Ghassanid son, Yazid ibn Abi al-Nims, led a revolt in Damascus that drove al-Darak's men out the city. The two factions then fought at the Battle of Majrahit, which lasted 20 days, beginning on the 18th of August 684. The far more numerous Qays were routed and many of them were killed as they retreated, including al-Darak and 80 other Qaysi notables. The survivors among the Qays, led by Zufar ibn al-Harith al-Kilabi of Hamir, fled north to the Euphrates town of al-Qarqiziyah, while Marwan was made caliph in Damascus. The Battle of Majrahit firmly divided the Arab tribes of Syria into Yamanites. According to Kennedy, the Qays had many dared to avenge and the feud was to continue for generations, while Marwan would be entirely dependent on the Yamani tribes who had elected him. Indeed, the Yaman helped Marwan assert his rule in Egypt and smoothly managed the accession of his son, Abd al-Malik. Following Marwan's death in 685, the Yamani leaders, Ibn Badal of Kalb and Raf ibn Zinbar of Judham, were Abd al-Malik's main supporters, other than his kinsmen. All the while, the Qays in Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria under Zufar's leadership remained steadfastly behind Ibn Zubair, and stymied the expansion of Umayyad authority to Zubair held Iraq. Raids. Following Majrahit, the Qays initiated a series of raids and counter-raids against the Yaman, particularly the latter's leading faction, the Kalb. Because each confrontation was typically a day long, the raids were referred to by medieval Arab sources as Ayyam, with each Yom named after the place where the attack occurred. The sources of the Ayyam battles were contemporary Arab poems and stories that were preserved in the Kitab al-Aghani, Kitab al-Hamasar, and the histories of al-Madaini and Ibn al-Atir. Historian Julius Wellhausen asserts that the accounts are mostly quite reliable, though partly without connection and chronology. The cycle of raids began following the battlefield defection of the Qaysi general and Sulaym chieftain, Umar ibn al-Habab, from the Umayyad army during the Battle of Qasir against the Zubairides in 686. The defection of Umar and his troops, who took refuge with Zufar in al-Qarqiziyah, was blamed for the rout of the Umayyad force, though the exact year is not available in contemporary sources. The first Ayyam raid was carried out by Zufar against a Kalb encampment at Musayuk in the environs of Hims, in which 20 Kalb tribesmen were killed. The Kalb, led by Umayyad ibn Hurayth ibn Badal, responded by killing 60 men from the Qaysi tribe of Numar living among the Kalb in Palmyra. Afterward, Umar led an assault on Uqayl, in the vicinity of Palmyra, that killed between 500 and 1,000 Kalb tribesmen. Umar evaded Umayyad's pursuit and made it back to al-Qahqiziyah. Umar followed up on his victory by leading several damaging raids against the Kalb in the dwelling places in the Samawa desert, including at a well-named Kaaba, in which Umayyad was nearly killed. The Kalb in Samawa ultimately fled for the Jordan Valley in Palestine as a result of the attacks. Umar later settled his Sulaym tribesmen along the Kaaba River, where they encroached on the grazing lands of the Talib. The latter, a Christian tribe belonging to the Rabra, had settlements stretching from the Kaaba eastward beyond the Tigris River. The Talib requested Zufar's intervention to evict the Sulaym, but Zufar was unable to mediate the dispute. Instead, Umar received sanction from the Zubayrides to assault the Talib, and with a large force he massacred numerous Talib tribesmen at the Kaaba village of Makashin. Further Qaysi Talib skirmishes, which also dragged in Zufar on the side of Umar, took place along the Kaaba, Tigris, Balik and Thawtha rivers. In 689, the Talib ambushed the Qays at the Thawtha village of al-Hashak near Tikrit. The ensuing battle lasted 3 days, and towards the end, Zufar and his Emir kinsmen retreated to al-Qahqiziyah and abandoned Umar, who was ultimately killed by the Talib. The latter sent Umar's head to Abd al-Malik. Obliged to avenge the death of his Qaysi comrade, Zufar retaliated against the Talib, dealing them a heavy blow at the Tigris village of Quhail. Afterward, he executed 200 captured Talib tribesmen. In 691, Abd al-Malik's siege of al-Qahqiziyah pushed Zufar to accept a negotiated surrender to Umayyad authority, but the agreement, Abd al-Malik incorporated Qaysi tribesmen into the Umayyad Qahtan army. The entry of Qays into the reconstituted Umayyad army of Syria ended Yamani, and specifically Kalbi, monopolization of that institution. From then on, Abd al-Malik sought to balance each faction's interest within the military. Abd al-Malik's forces also defeated the Umayyad Zubayride rivals and patrons of the Qays, Misa'ib ibn al-Zubair in Iraq in October 691 and Abdullah ibn al-Zubair in Mecca in September 692. These developments put an end to Qaysi attacks against the Talib. Around this time, the Talib celebrated poet and representative to the Umayyad court, al-Aqtal, recited a poem to Abd al-Malik boasting of the victory over Qays and the surrender to Abd al-Malik. The men of Qays came forth hastening to pledge allegiance to you publicly after long denial. May God never lead Qays back from their error, and may no one say, "Take care," when they stumble. They lived in blessed abundance till they were caught in Satan's snares. Al-Aqtal, circa 691–90. Despite Abd al-Malik's accord with the Qays, the two camps continued to attack each other. Thereafter, the battle spread to the Hejaz and Iraq, unlike most of the early confrontations, which occurred in Upper Mesopotamia and the Palmyrene steppe. Thus, the Qays-Yaman conflict broke out of its Syrian confines and into the wider Islamic world. Umayyad still sought revenge for prior losses the Kalb suffered at the hands of the Emir and Sulaym, but since those two tribes were now under Abd al-Malik's protection, Umayyad resolved to attack the Qaysi tribe of Fazara. The latter mainly lived east of Medina, but the ruling clan inhabited Kufa. They were not previously involved in attacks against the Yaman. Umayyad acquired a warrant from the Umayyad prince, Khalid ibn Yazid, to collect the cattle tax from the Fazara on behalf of Abd al-Malik's government. Using this legal cover, Umayyad led a large expeditionary force of Kalb clans against Fazara tribesmen in Iraq, killing and wounding many, particularly at a place called The Fazara protested these assaults to Abd al-Malik, who responded by paying them blood money, which the Fazara, in turn, used to purchase weaponry and horses. In circa 692–93, the Fazara retaliated against the Kalb in a surprise attack against their encampment at the Banat Qayn wells in the Samawa, which ended with the deaths of 69 Kalb tribesmen. The raid on Banat Qayn was the most celebrated of the ayam between Qays and Kalb. Infuriated at the Fazara's attack, Abd al-Malik ordered his general al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf to lead an expedition against the Fazara. However, the two main Fazara commanders from Banat Qayn, Said ibn Uyayn and Halhala ibn Qays, surrendered themselves to avert a military assault against the tribe. The Fazara commanders were then executed to satisfy the Kalb, who accepted it as a compensation for the losses. Tribal balancing in the state. Abd al-Malik's ability to end Qays Yamani violence was mostly limited to issuing threats or paying blood money, though he succeeded in transforming the Umayyad Caliphate into a centralized, bureaucratic state with decreasing reliance on the Syrian army. Kennedy notes that the Qays Yaman feud illustrated the problems of transition in the Caliphate from nomadism to settled life and governance. After 691, each faction became associated with an Umayyad prince. The Qays allied themselves with Abd al-Malik's brother and governor of Upper Mesopotamia, Muhammad ibn Marwan, while the Yaman were associated with Abd al-Malik's Palestine-based son, Sulaym. These affiliations played an important role during future intra-Umayyad rivalry. After the accession of al-Walid, Qays Yamani tensions simmered, but did not result in serious conflict. Al-Walid, whose mother Walid was Qaysi, afforded the Qays a degree of privilege. Nonetheless, the Yaman held significant influence with other branches of the Umayyad household, namely with Sulaym, but also Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, who maintained the ties his father established with Yamani army leaders in Egypt. Moreover, with the accession of Sulaym in 715, the Yamani general Raja ibn Haywa of Kinda became his chief advisor, and the Yaman regained their advantageous position within the Umayyad state. There is disagreement among historians over the basis of the Qays-Yaman conflict during and after Sulayman's reign. Medieval Arab sources describe the conflict mainly as a tribal rivalry. M.A. Shaban asserts that the Qays came to represent the policies of Islamic expansionism and Arab governmental monopolization embraced by Abd al-Malik and the powerful governor al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, while the Yaman supported stabilizing the Caliphate's borders and assimilating non-Arabs into the state. The Yaman's allies and successive caliphs, Sulayman and Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, pursued such policies. Kennedy argues against Shaban's theory, instead holding that the conflict was between two factions based on tribal loyalties, which sought to control access to military power and the privileges that went with it. To that end, the ultimate goal for each faction was the caliph's favor and appointment to provincial governorships. As a Yamani alignment among the Arab tribes was present throughout the caliphate, and avoiding association with either camp became increasingly difficult for Muslim leaders. In Iraq, the two major rival tribes, Azd and Taman, became the central vital component of the Yaman and Qays respectively in the province. The Qays-Yaman rivalry also played out among constituent Arab tribes in the Umayyad army in Khorasan, though Shaban characterized Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz as strongly pro-Yamani for his efforts to integrate non-Arab Muslim communities. The Caliph evidently maintained a more balanced policy in regard to the rivalry and sought to end the tribal factionalism. His appointment of provincial governors was based on competence and loyalty to his authority. To that end, he appointed the Qaysi stalwart Umar ibn Hubayri as governor of Upper Mesopotamia and dismissed the Yamani governor of Iraq and Khorasan Yazid ibn al-Mahalib Azd in favor of several governors, many of whom were not Yamani. Nonetheless, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz's reforms threatened Qaysi interests, and following his death in 720, the Qays helped restore the old order through his successor Yazid II. During Yazid II's reign, Ibn al-Mahalib revolted in Iraq, capturing Wasit and Kufa. It is not apparent that he was supported by the Yamani tribes of Syria, and his revolt was crushed by a strong ally of the Qays, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik. Umar ibn Hubayra's subsequent appointment to Iraq saw the violent purge of Yamani leaders in the province. Yazid died in 724 and his successor, Hisham, managed to avoid entanglement with the Qays-Yaman rivalry, and appointed Khalid al-Kashri from the ostensibly neutral Bajila tribe as governor Iraq. Hisham's reign was one of the most internally peaceful periods in the Umayyad Caliphate, and there were no violent incidents reported between the Qays and Yaman within the Umayyad army during this period. Toward the end of his reign, and out concern for maintaining stability in the aftermath of his death, Hisham increasingly relied on Qaysi support. To that end, in 738, he replaced al-Kashri, who had possible Yamani sympathies, with the staunch Qaysi Yusuf ibn Umar of Thaqif, and appointed another Qaysi stalwart Nasir ibn Sayyar as governor of Ghassan. Third Muslim civil war. The Qays-Yaman feud persisted, but the caliphate remained stable and prosperous by the time of Hisham's death in 743. However, this situation unraveled as a result of the policies and incompetence of his successor, Al-Walid II. The latter left the state administration largely in the hands of Hisham's Qaysi appointees, and his arrest of the Yaman's patrons among the Umayyad family rallied the Yaman against his rule. Walid II's governance was seen by members of the Umayyad family as so egregious that a section of them, led by Yazid III, decided to depose him, an unprecedented action in Umayyad dynastic history. Though much of the Umayyad family and other leaders were reluctant to back Yazid III, the Yamani tribes, partly led by the Kalbi chieftain Mansur ibn Jumhur, provided him critical support. The Yaman were motivated by a desire to re-establish the once dominant position in the state. The rebels captured Damascus, then besieged and killed Walid II in the vicinity of Palmyra in 744. Consequently, the Qays-Yaman conflict violently intensified. Kennedy asserts, "It would be wrong to imagine that all members of these two groups were implacably hostile. It would seem that the violence was begun by extremists, like Yusuf ibn Umar for the Isis and Mansur ibn Jumhur for the Yamanis, but once it had begun, it was very difficult to stop and came to involve the whole Syrian army and political elite. It was this fatal division, more than anything else, which destroyed Umayyad government." Yazid III's reign lasted 6 months, during which he briefly appointed Ibn Jumhur governor of Ghassan. He was succeeded by his brother Ibrahim ibn al-Walid, but in December 744 the latter was overthrown by Marwan II, a strong man favored by the Qays of Upper Mesopotamia and the Byzantine frontier. The Qays were the only part of the Syrian elite that backed Marwan II's usurpation, after which the leaders of Yaman were driven out of Syria. A rebellion in the Kalb stronghold of Homs ensued, but was suppressed by Marwan II in 746. Opposition to Marwan II sparked rebellions in the provinces east of Syria, with Ibn Jumhur throwing his lot with the Alid rebel Abdullah ibn Mu'awiyah. Marwan II dispatched the Qaysi Yazid ibn Umar to suppress the Alid Yamani revolt in Kufa. Ultimately, the Yamen of Syria and Iraq, and the Kharijids under al-Darak al-Shaybani, were defeated by Marwan II's forces, and a respite in the war was achieved by the spring of 748. However, by December 748, the Abbasid revolution in Ghassan was in earnest, and its leader, Abu Muslim, drove out the Qaysi governor Nasr ibn Sayyid from Merv and advanced westward. Yazid ibn Umar dispatched the Qaysi generals Nubatar ibn Hanzala of Kilab and Amir ibn Dabara of Marat to halt Abu Muslim's march, but they were defeated by Qutaba ibn Shabib of Tayy. Iraq, with the exception of Qaysi-held Wasit, was conquered by the Abbasids under as-Saffar in October 749. Qaysi troops rallied behind Marwan II as he advanced against the Abbasids, but he was decisively defeated at the Battle of Zab in February 750. Umayyad power all but diminished as a result. When the Abbasid army reached Damascus in pursuit of Marwan II, Yamani tribesmen facilitated their entry into the city.